61. Confirming the authenticity of magic. The theory behind the magic was simple, basically what Professor Binns had just explained, but the book added a great deal of detail and many specific procedures. The crucial step, it said, was to inscribe numerous ancient runes on the outer shell of the soul. It was like drawing patterns on a doll with a watercolor pen. But the pen's ink had to be special. It needed to contain fragments of other beings' outer soul shells, not just human soul remnants. Soul shells from magical creatures were even better, and those from creatures with powerful soul magic were best of all. Binns had written about a trip to a dragon cemetery where he used magic to collect the residual outer soul shells from a recently dead dragon. So, although this magic concerned the soul, the materials came from discarded outer soul shells of dead magical beings, which put it in a different category from the usual dark arts that tampered directly with souls. The book also listed prerequisite spells and preparations, ways to collect outer soul shells from corpses, methods to cut one's own outer soul shell, and so on. It even speculated about future developments, using the soul itself to attack an opponent's soul after projecting it, or using the soul to carry the body and fly. But the book did not give the most important part, the exact method for carving ancient runes onto one's own outer soul shell. It only stated that it had to be done. On the last page, Binns had written, "Everyone's soul is different, and so is the shell that surrounds it. Even a small mistake in the carving can harm the caster's soul. The more powerful the soul magic you can wield, the larger and smoother the outer soul shell will be," Binns had added. "So the number of runes, the speed, and every detail of the carving will differ for each wizard. I cannot experiment on hundreds or thousands of wizards," he'd concluded. "I must teach by hand, once I can see what your outer soul shell actually looks like." "All right, I'll trouble you then, Professor Binns," Arthur had said. Binns had smiled. "No trouble at all. That is my wish as well." After finishing the book, Arthur left Binns's office. According to Binns, he would need to learn the prerequisite magic and prepare the materials. He didn't go back to the dormitory or the room of requirement, though. He sought out Dumbledore. What Binns had explained was only one side of the story. The magic was tempting, but it could be dangerous. The previous wizard to have learned this soul projection magic had been Dumbledore himself. If Arthur were to trust anyone in this world, a wizard who could be called truly good, it would be Albus Dumbledore. Dumbledore might be an old eccentric, and he might scheme when necessary against Voldemort, but he'd shown Arthur kindness before. When Arthur suffered from the unicorn curse, Dumbledore had given him a choice instead of forcing him into conflict. This time, Arthur approached the headmaster's office again. The door wasn't open. He knocked on the stone gargoyle. The gargoyle pushed his hand aside impatiently, and the door swung open. Dumbledore looked up from his desk, set down his pen, and asked kindly, "Mr. Black, have you had any trouble with the Patronus charm, or have you found the answer?" Arthur shook his head. "No, Professor. This is about Professor Binns." "Professor Binns?" Dumbledore's voice rose, a mix of surprise and interest. Arthur explained Binns's invitation to learn the magic. As the wizard who had once learned the technique, Dumbledore understood immediately. "I did not expect you to have the aptitude for this," he said with a small smile. "If you truly can learn it, you may not even need the Patronus to remove your curse." Relief washed through Arthur. He had worried Binns might be a fraud. Ghosts could behave oddly because of the way they'd lived. Some, like the Bloody Baron, had peculiar, long-standing habits. Baron had been known to stare fixedly at the sky for centuries. Dumbledore, however, produced a densely written sheet from a cabinet and handed it to Arthur. "Professor Binns has been a ghost for over 1,000 years, Dumbledore said. Some of his thinking is no longer entirely that of the living. He seeks out talented wizards to teach his magic, but he may not fully appreciate the harm it can do." Dumbledore explained his own experience. After his first soul projection, his soul strength had been insufficient. Having used charms to cut his outer soul shell, he'd caused irreversible damage to himself. Later, he developed a magic to mend those cracks. Arthur read the paper. It described directly mending one's outer soul shell fractures with the outer soul shells of magical creatures. He was very glad he had come to Dumbledore. If he had to face the magic alone and failed the way Dumbledore once had, he would be in real trouble. He did not possess Dumbledore's facility for developing new spells. Dumbledore seemed to sense Arthur's lingering doubts about Binns. "Mr. Black," he said softly, "no wizard's path is without obstacles. The misfortune that befell me later became invaluable experience when I specialized in certain magics. When you meet difficulties in learning, you can turn them into growth. And if something truly cannot be managed alone, you will need the help of friends or elders." Arthur felt Dumbledore's selflessness and, with respect, said, "I understand, Professor Dumbledore. You can call me Arthur." "All right, Arthur." After Dumbledore confirmed the magic's authenticity, Arthur left the headmaster's office, but not before borrowing the Mirror of Erised. Even if soul projection seemed especially suited to him now, extra precautions were sensible. The mirror no longer affected Dumbledore, and he readily told Arthur where it was kept, in the hidden stuff room in the Room of Requirement. He had put it there while Arthur was in class. Stepping out of Dumbledore's office, Arthur reflected on the last few days, experiences he'd never imagined. He had thought his power would grow gradually, he'd defeat the big boss, and then enjoy a carefree life at Hogwarts, like progressing through a video game in his previous life. But perhaps his presence in this world had already changed things. From the moment he entered Hogwarts, his student life had been unlikely to be ordinary unless he were like Peter Pettigrew, living unnoticed and miserable. There was a lot to do: make his wand, learn the Patronus, learn soul projection. Thinking of these difficult tasks, a flash of childish irritation rose in him, the kind of annoyance he'd felt as a schoolboy faced with a mountain of weekend homework. He rarely felt that since coming here. But remembering Dumbledore's words, Arthur suppressed the irritation and smiled. He was beginning to feel like a wizard of this world. If he needed a release, he could always write more letters to Fleur, or give Draco Malfoy a good, humbling lesson. Draco had become a little too pleased with himself lately. It was normal to be carried away after doing what others could not, but someone needed to knock him down a peg. Arthur was perfectly willing to be that someone. 62. Draco started studying. The next day, after class, Arthur found Draco and led him to the Room of Requirement. The moment Draco stepped inside, he blurted out, "Oh, Merlin's flowery pants? This is the training place you told me about? It's incredible. It's so big, I don't think even the professor's offices are this huge. No wonder you don't want to go back to the dormitory." Anyone would feel the same. For Draco, it was his first time seeing the Room of Requirement. To Arthur, it looked just as it had before. Near the entrance lay a huge living room with a cozy sitting area. Beyond that stood a massive workbench where Arthur practiced alchemy. The farthest and largest section was devoted to charms practice, an uneven training field scarred by fallen dummies and other marks of battle. The whole room even had a huge window that let in sunlight, though the light was only an illusion conjured by the room itself at Arthur's command. He could make it seem like day or night at will. Draco darted about, inspecting the most conspicuous features: the battered training ground, the toppled practice dummies, the neat piles of materials on the workbench. He admired Arthur all the more for it. He didn't understand all the alchemical supplies, but he knew alchemy was rare in this age, something his own father did not practice. After the tour, Draco turned to Arthur. "So why did you bring me here?" Draco didn't imagine Arthur wanted them to share the room forever. Arthur hadn't told him the room could change itself to suit someone's needs, and there was only one bed in view, a large bed, but not the sort Arthur would use for sleeping with others, not unless it was a very special senior. Arthur watched Draco's excited energy and thought about the grim future looming over the wizarding world. War might come in a few years. If the future was to be changed at all, Draco had to be stronger. At the very least, he needed to be able to stand up and take on an ordinary Death Eater by himself. Arthur couldn't be at Draco's side all the time. If Draco became capable enough, the Malfoys might at least be able to flee rather than be completely dominated when Lord Voldemort returned, rather than living in daily terror, perhaps even being forced to host Voldemort in their own manner. The image of that was unsettling enough. Voldemort, living under the Malfoys' roof, his relationship with Bellatrix, the thought of children born of twisted loyalties. Arthur still couldn't imagine how Bellatrix could be drawn to him. After meeting the real Voldemort, he found the sight more revolting than anything Quirrell had ever shown. He half-joked to himself that he wanted a charger to plug into that noseless face. Direct, heavy-handed training would not work. Arthur had supervised Draco for a while, but had been pulled away by other things, and Draco had relaxed. He needed a plan. "Draco," Arthur said, "no one in Slytherin dares cross you now, but what about the other houses? As a Slytherin, are you only going to swagger on your own turf?" Draco scratched his head. "Does anyone still dare provoke me? Of course. Do you think Harry Potter's afraid of you? He's the boy who lived, everyone's hero." "Humph. What hero? He's no different from me. I don't believe he could have beaten you-know-who as a baby. Maybe his parents stalled him, and then Dumbledore turned up and finished it. If I hadn't been so busy lately, I'd have gone looking for trouble with him myself." That arrogant smugness was common now among many wizards. The story of a newborn overcoming one of the world's most feared wizards sounded almost mythical. Arthur prodded a little. "But you can't beat him, can you?" Draco opened his mouth to snap back, then paused. Arthur continued, "Remember the duel in the trophy room? You didn't defeat him there. You had an advantage. You're older, more experienced, but you still didn't win." If anyone else had said it, Draco would have snapped, but Arthur was his only real friend, and he couldn't best Arthur. It was also the truth. Arthur put a hand on Draco's shoulder. "Draco, I'll tell you something. I need a lot of time to learn certain magics to lift the curse on me. I don't have time to make Slytherin famous for you right now." For a moment, Draco's eyes widened. "Arthur, you're in trouble? What kind of curse? My father knows plenty of people. Maybe he could help." Arthur was glad Draco wasn't pretending. He shook his head. "It's all right. Professor Dumbledore has already helped with most of it. I still have to learn some special magic myself, though." "Good," Draco said with relief. "At least Dumbledore's done something right." Then his face hardened with worry. "But what about after that? I have no talent for charms. Without you, Slytherin will be ruined. Potter already has his reputation, and there's that know-it-all girl." Arthur looked Draco squarely in the eyes. "Isn't that exactly why you need to step up? Are you going to be inferior to Harry Potter? Do you want Slytherin's glory to slip through your fingers?" At the mention of Harry, Draco's blush of indignation brightened. "How could I be inferior to that boy? I'll show him what happens to someone who isn't my friend and chooses to hang around the Weasleys." "Good," Arthur said. "From now on, you'll come here to train your magic. I'll set aside a section just for you." Draco's bravado faltered. "Ah, that sounds like hard work." "Of course it will be," Arthur said. "Don't you want to stand in the center of the Great Hall someday and be the one everyone praises? Do you want that honor to go to Harry Potter? Think about it. Once you're truly powerful, the girl you'll be courting in the future won't be Pansy." At the thought of embracing Pansy, Draco shivered. He had always been put off by her sharp tongue. He preferred his mother's gentle manner. Resigned, he said, "All right, Arthur." "Good, if you're willing." Arthur went to a nearby cabinet and pulled out a stack of thick books, more than a dozen, piled higher than Draco. He set them down in front of the boy. "Start with these. Read them carefully, one by one." Draco stared up at the tower of books, alarmed. "That's a lot. It looks difficult." "Oh, it won't be that hard," Arthur said, smiling. "Draco, you have to believe you're a genius." Chapter 63. As the first year drew to a close, Arthur was ready. After Draco resigned himself to his fate, Arthur led him out of the room of requirement, reimagined it, and led him back inside. It looked like the room Draco had seen before, but Arthur had added a soundproofed training alcove off to one side, reserved entirely for Draco, and a small lounge beside the main entrance. When they stepped in again, Draco could hardly believe his eyes. "Oh, Merlin's beard. Arthur, how did you do that?" he breathed, running a hand over the walls and fixtures, as if to make sure they were real. The charms he'd learned in class had seemed like tricks compared to this. He darted from one new feature to the next, only relaxing when he was satisfied everything was genuine. "This is incredible. I've never seen anything like it." Arthur smiled. "It's under my control. From now on, when you walk past that door 3 times where I came in and think Arthur's room, It will open for you. Don't think of anything else while you're doing it, or you might end up somewhere even Dumbledore can't find." He didn't tell Draco everything. The last thing he needed was the boy designing a Quidditch training pitch for himself. Draco nodded earnestly. "I understand, Arthur. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone." Draco was seeing the room's magic for the first time and bounded straight to his training area, wand in hand. The practice dummies reset themselves after he knocked them down. Some were moving targets, others shaped to resemble Harry Potter, which made Draco only more eager to try different charms. Arthur, meanwhile, went back to Professor Binns's notes and read, learning the magic Binns had written down. When Draco went to call Arthur down for dinner, Arthur had no intention of leaving. "Draco, what do you want to eat?" he asked instead. "Wait, can this room conjure food?" Draco asked, surprised. "Of course not," Arthur said. "It's a simple device I made." "Right, then today I'll have a steak, 2 chicken legs, a pack of small fries, and a glass of orange juice." Arthur wrote the order on a slip of paper, scribbled another note for himself, and pressed a small button on the main door. A house elf appeared in the doorway. Arthur handed over the note. The house elf vanished and reappeared a moment later, carrying 2 plates piled with food. When it received the plates, the house elf looked positively honored, eyes watering, bowing and murmuring its gratitude until Arthur gently told it to go back to the kitchen. Draco watched in fascination. "Hogwarts has house elves? I thought everything here was pure magic. How did you make them appear?" "They've been at Hogwarts since we started school. When we arrived, they delivered our trunks to the dorms," Arthur explained. "I spoke with the kitchen and made a simple alchemical link. One device on this door, another in the kitchen. Press this button, and the kitchen gets a signal. That's all." Draco's admiration only deepened. Arthur had already moved far beyond what one would expect from a boy his age, crafting alchemical devices while others worried about homework. Time moved quickly toward the end of the year. With only a week until finals, many of the first years were cramming, desperately flipping open textbooks they'd mostly ignored since classes began. Draco still visited Arthur often, though not every day. He'd put on weight and looked healthier and stronger than before. He also kept trying to provoke Harry into another duel, eager to prove himself. Hermione and Ron kept stepping in to stop the fights, still wary after how badly the last duel had gone. Arthur, for his part, threw himself into Binns's magic and experiments. He used the Mirror of Erised to create a false future image to aid his practice of the Patronus charm, and he slowed the final stages of making his own wand. He wanted the unicorn's remnant soul, the fragment tied to the unicorn horn he planned to use, to have time to settle inside the blood-stained horn so it could recuperate there. Whether the unicorn's remnant stayed or left, that arrangement would be better for both the creature and the wand taken from it. He worked hard on the Patronus, but made no anthropomorphic guardian. Only a great ball of light burst from the tip of his wand. Eventually, he gave up trying to force the charm. He suspected the unicorn's remnant soul was affecting him. The Patronus charm relies on positive thoughts guided by the soul. If his soul was being influenced by another consciousness, producing a Patronus could be impossible for a while. Still, Arthur had learned all of Binns's prerequisite magics and the compensatory methods Dumbledore had shown him in case of failure. He had even gone into the Forbidden Forest on a leave Dumbledore granted to retrieve the unicorn's fragmented soul shell from its corpse. He kept that shard, along with other materials, because it might be useful later, especially if the remnant soul were to separate. To gather the rest of what he needed, Arthur mobilized the House of Black and called on an uncle in France. He arranged to have several dead Thunderbird corpses purchased in the United States and sent to a warehouse owned by the Blacks. For the soul shell required to carve ancient runes, Arthur chose a Thunderbird rather than a dragon for 2 reasons. Thunderbirds have a lightning attribute, and they're connected to phoenixes, which made them work well with another crucial material, phoenix tail feathers. Those feathers came from Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix. Arthur had almost plucked Fawkes clean, getting what he needed. When everything was prepared, Arthur took the materials to Professor Binns's office. Dumbledore kept watch over the boys as always, ready to intervene should anything go wrong. Arthur took a deep breath and stepped into Professor Binns's office. It was noticeably cleaner than before, not a speck of dust anywhere. Sunlight streamed through the window and made the room feel more lived in. Professor Binns looked up, brightened at the sight of him, and said, "Mr. Black, I did not expect you to master so much of what I taught so quickly." Arthur smiled and answered with a seriousness that startled even himself. "I'm ready, Professor Binns." "Very well, I'll teach you the final step." Binns drifted forward and regarded him. "Release your soul." Arthur sat, concentrated his mind in his skull, and held his wand in his left hand. He cast the soul projection charm. A white light flashed. He guided it to the outer shell of his soul and eased a small opening into that shell. Through it, the soul slipped free, still wrapped in the shell. This was the first time Binns had actually seen Arthur's soul. When he'd probed it before, he had only sensed its power. Seeing it now shocked him. Arthur's soul was enormous, almost twice the size of his body, a scale far beyond that of an ordinary wizard. If it kept growing as Arthur matured, it might one day rival a small giant. More than its size, the soul was unlike any the professor had encountered. Threaded through it were streaks of lightning, both white and black. Arthur could feel it too. Very few living wizards ever saw their own soul, but now, as a disembodied consciousness, he perceived how disconnected body and soul could be. His body moved independently of his will. His soul felt free. The world itself presented differently. A misty haze of currents and vapors surrounded everything, and by following those mists, he could sense beyond solid walls, like a limited X-ray, about 10 meters in every direction. The visions were black and white. The only exception was Professor Binns, who appeared a grayish-black with a faint green tinge. This experience matched what Dumbledore had once said. Even if one does not formally learn this branch of magic, the act of projecting one's soul is a crucial experience for later study. The vapors were the magic of nature, and Arthur, as a soul, was exquisitely sensitive to them, like a fish suddenly in water. He tried to command magic. The magic gathered around him, forming a tiny whirl, but when it reached his soul, it simply passed through without binding. Binns watched silently. His own first soul projection had been similar. The way a soul perceives the world is fundamentally different from the body's perception. Curiosity was natural, like a muggle stumbling into the wizarding world. Eventually, Binns spoke. "Mr. Black, a wizard's soul on its own cannot use magic. It must have a vessel." Arthur nodded. He understood. Even the most learned, such as Lord Voldemort, could not perform magic without a vessel. After Quirrell's death, Voldemort raged impotently, his soul unable to work through anything but raw force against Harry, and then he fled. The analogy was simple. The soul draws magic from nature but needs a physical vessel to channel it. Think of the soul wanting to use magic like gasoline, the world like the gas station, and the body like the car. Without the car, the gasoline can't make anything run. Having completed soul projection, Arthur had reached the last stage of the lesson. This was also the most important part. One Binns had not previously taught, how to inscribe ancient runes onto the soul's outer shell. Arthur slipped back through the opening into his body. Emerging before had felt like tearing free of long, tight bindings. Returning felt different, as if his essence shifted from mist to liquid and was drawn into the bottle of the soul shell. Once inside, he stood and moved a little awkwardly, then soon felt naturally himself again. He reached into his robe and produced the materials. A small pouch contained a sheet of white, soft membrane, smoother and purer than any fish bladder, an outer shell taken from a thunderbird's soul. Beside it, in a wooden bowl, lay dozens of phoenix tail feathers, soaked in a green liquid. Binns inspected them and nodded with approval. "This is our only chance," he said, his tone grave. "Concentrate." Arthur returned the nod, equally serious. He wanted this to succeed. In truth, the soul projection had already been a success. Now the final sealing and rune engraving would allow him to stabilize what he'd done, and later, to deal with the remnant of the unicorn soul still within him. If he left the tear in his soul's outer shell unsealed, he would be drawing on reserves he could not safely spend, risking long-term damage to his potential. And the unicorn remnant could not be forced out hastily. He needed time to grow accustomed to the sensations and powers of his soul before attempting to resolve that fragment. Otherwise, Any mistake might injure his soul further and make the flaw in its outer shell far worse. Chapter 65: Soul Shell Transformation. Once the materials were ready, Arthur, at Professor Binns' signal, projected his soul again. Professor Binns studied the soul shell carefully. Arthur watched from the side. Until now, he had been focused on external perception and hadn't really examined his own inner form. To his surprise, his soul shell took the shape of a white unicorn, its fur distinct and clearly visible. The only flaw was that the entirely white unicorn bore streaks of blood-red markings, concentrated almost entirely along its long horn. Perhaps those marks were a remnant of the unicorn's own spirit. Seeing Arthur's astonished face, Professor Binns explained, "This is normal. Most people's soul shells appear as animals. The form a Patronus takes in the Patronus charm is actually the projected image of the soul shell." "But doesn't the Patronus's form change based on the wizard?" Arthur asked. "Of course," Binns said. "But the soul shell changes first, and the Patronus follows. The Patronus is a projection of the soul shell. The soul shell is a bridge between a person's soul and their body. The pivotal thing is the wizard's soul itself. That's the source of all changes. This is the strange magic of the soul. It's a pity many ancient spells and theories have been lost. I only gained a proper understanding when I became a ghost." Arthur, still absorbing the sight of his unicorn shell, asked, "Wouldn't it be better to inscribe ancient runes using a unicorn shell?" Professor Binns shook his head. "Generally, like Patronuses, most wizards' soul shells are ordinary animals, and often incomplete. That's why I use a dragon's shell. I didn't expect yours to be a unicorn. In that case, using a unicorn shell would be ideal. But there aren't many naturally deceased unicorns nowadays, not unless you killed one and accepted the attendant curse." Arthur choked on an awkward laugh. "Let's keep using the Thunderbirds, Professor Binns. What's next?" "Reconstruct another you." "Reconstruct? A me?" Arthur blinked. Binns pointed at the unicorn shell. "Yes, a person's character and preferences can change over time. If the ancient runes carved on the shell are affected by future changes, the shell might partially self-destruct. We need to separate your current shell, use it as a conduit, and build a new shell for your soul to live in, connected to the present one. That way, if you change later, your altered shell won't affect the current one. This process must be guided directly by another soul. Even a ghost alone isn't sufficient. It must be a ghost like me that has absorbed its own soul shell. That's why, even if I wrote the method down, no living wizard could learn it from a book." Arthur's soul thrummed with shock as he listened. He had thought Binns' magic was similar to Lord Voldemort's dark arts that tampered with the soul, only without harming living magical creatures. He had not expected Binns to go further and modify the soul shell itself. It was comparable in gravity to dark arts like Horcruxes, the main difference being it didn't target the wizard's soul directly, nor require the deaths of others. If Arthur had not already experienced the effects of soul magic, he would never have agreed to this. Unlike many cursed wizards, Arthur had a fallback, Ladian Fa Wang, Thunderbolt King. With Heavenly Thunder, he could become Voldemort's adversary and, together with Dumbledore or Harry, the prophesied savior, confront Voldemort. If absolutely necessary, he might even attack the unicorn's remnant soul. But having witnessed the power of the soul, Arthur wanted it. He wanted the ability to control soul magic. It would accelerate his magical development and augment his Ladian Fa Wang power. His main limitation was magical power, constrained by his body. He couldn't burn through the Philosopher's Stone fragment Nicholas Flamel had given him every time he faced a tough opponent. In the game system from his previous life, his character faced Voldemort at 25, roughly the age when a wizard reaches his peak. Even then, defeating Voldemort had been brutally difficult. After the trap Voldemort had set for him last time, Arthur no longer underestimated the wizards of this world. Outside of the basic narrative that Harry is the savior and Voldemort the villain, many things could change. That Nicholas Flamel, who had lived 600 years and whose prophecies carried weight, had given Arthur a fragment of the Philosopher's Stone was strange. A seer of Flamel's stature would only aid a single young wizard if a future crisis threatened the entire magical world. Helping a small wizard without a world-shaking reason seemed unlikely. Arthur suspected a grave crisis lay ahead, perhaps Voldemort himself, perhaps someone else. He wanted to learn Binns's magic. A small, quiet conviction told him this was the right path. At the same time, Flamel's gift left him uneasy. What did it mean to know your future? If someone knew they would die naturally at 80, would their actions alter that fate? Did Flamel give him the stone's fragment because he foresaw failure that would weaken Arthur later, forcing the fragment to be necessary? Or even if Arthur succeeded now, would he still need the fragment later? Questions crowded his mind. He had no answers. Still, he wanted to try. Learning deep magic had to involve risk. Maybe because this was the real world, the Lei Dian Fa Wang template he'd carried from the game might function differently. There was no talent panel here. Besides, Dumbledore had given him a spell that could compensate if the procedure failed, making the worst-case scenario a few wasted months rather than permanent harm. All that considered, Arthur looked at Professor Binns and said, "Professor Binns, let's begin." 66. Another dead professor. Professor Binns had been visibly anxious as he explained the final steps of his magic and watched Arthur's repeated hesitations. When Arthur finally agreed, Binns let out a long sigh of relief. He reached into himself and produced a transparent, film-like object. "What is that?" Arthur asked, recognizing it at once. "This is the soul shell of my original body," Binns said. "I need it to see your soul shell clearly." Arthur fell silent. Binns nodded, accepting his fate without fear. "Yes, in doing this, I will truly die. But death is not the end for a wizard. You know that. I've been in this world for 1,000 years. That's long enough for me. I would like to continue in some way, and I'm curious about what follows. If someone learns this magic, perhaps my work will live on." Seeing the sincerity in Binns's eyes, Arthur's earlier resentment at being kept from the last step melted away. Binns' translucent form began to take on substance as he guided Arthur through the reconstruction of his soul shell. Most of Arthur's original shell was trimmed away, and the removed pieces were reworked. Binns instructed Arthur to stitch them together with treated phoenix tail feathers wrapped in a layer of Thunderbird soul shell. The phoenix feathers, having been soaked in various herbal infusions for a month, had become as fine and soft as thread. After being coated with Thunderbird soul shell, they were nearly invisible. When sewn, the repaired shell formed a hollow, spherical casing, an egg-like shell that would become Arthur's new soul shell. Under Binns' direction, Arthur used the remaining phoenix feathers and Thunderbird shell to reinforce the unicorn shell he had been using before. It was painstaking, meticulous work, less like performing magic and more like delicate needlework aided by magic. Many times, Binns lent his dwindling soul power to help. Without that assistance, Arthur's own soul would not have managed it. Whenever Arthur's shell suffered, he felt untethered, as if he were a bit of rootless duckweed, and his thoughts blurred. No wonder a second soul was required to steady the work. Once the two shells were trimmed, Arthur used the leftover scraps to construct a passage between them. That passage would be under his control, allowing his soul to travel freely between shells with almost no harm. The final task was to inscribe ancient runes along the seams of the two shells. With the notebook Binns provided and his clear instructions, Arthur finished the runic work quickly. By then, Binns' ghostly body had faded to near transparency. The soul power stored in his shell was almost spent. He had become little more than a specter, incapable of sustaining his own soul or channeling magic. He looked at Arthur and said, "You may now enter the reconstructed soul shell. Once it fully links your soul and body, it will gradually form into a shape suited to your essence. From my experience, it will take about a month. During that time, do not use your soul power." Arthur bowed. He could see that Binns might leave the world at any moment. In his last breaths, the old professor urged him, "Don't forget your promise. Let the world remember that I once existed and that I contributed to the development of soul magic." He looked around the office, as if committing the castle itself to memory. Binns had taught history of magic at Hogwarts for as long as anyone could remember, and he mourned how much ancient magic had already been lost. He did not want the rest of his work to vanish as well. Perhaps, he thought, if Slytherin had not departed so long ago, things might have turned out differently. With a mix of regret and the comfort of having left an heir to his art, Professor Binns finally slipped from the world. When Arthur re-entered his body, he felt a slight, disconcerting lag, less than a second, between soul and flesh. He could control his limbs, but the delay made everything feel off. He could sense the condition of his soul shell, but could not alter it. After he finished packing away the instruments, Dumbledore appeared in the office. He already knew the procedure had succeeded and wore a relieved smile. "Arthur, how do you feel?" Dumbledore asked. "I'm fine, Professor," Arthur replied. "It's a bit uncomfortable, but Professor Binns said it should settle in about a month." "That is good to hear. Still, the finals are nearly upon us, and the loss of the History of Magic professor is unfortunate." Dumbledore's voice was steady. "I'll cover his duties for the next week." "Thank you, Professor." "It is nothing. There are many things I can do before you all set out into the world." Having once been taught soul projection by Binns long ago, Dumbledore knew firsthand the advantages the technique gave a wizard. He had thought that Harry, the so-called savior, had not reached the heights of power that he and Grindelwald had once aspired to. The wizarding world was turbulent, and an exceptional young wizard like Arthur, imperfect, perhaps a touch proud like Grindelwald, but full of potential, was a reassuring presence. After leaving the office, Arthur returned to the room of requirement. A red orb of light lay in his palm, the broken unicorn horn from his previous soul shell, the last vestige of the unicorn's residual soul. Because the curse on him had attached to the soul shell rather than entering his soul directly, Binns had been able to separate that fragment of the unicorn's essence during the reconstruction. Arthur now planned to continue making his wand, allowing the unicorn's residual soul to reawaken slowly inside the physical horn until, in time, it regained independent consciousness. Soon it was time for final exams. Among the first years, perhaps only Arthur seemed untroubled. The others were cramming from dawn to dusk. Draco was no exception. After Arthur had once mentioned Harry, Draco had pestered Harry a few times, but in recent days he had kept away from everyone and spent most of his time in the library. During exams, the library saw its busiest days of the year. The finals were in June, and Hogwarts had begun to feel muggy. The great exam hall was oppressively hot. Arthur missed air conditioning. Even though wizards had all manner of magical talents, they didn't always know how to make life comfortable. The wizarding market was small, too. When someone did invent a useful magical device, it often stayed expensive and out of reach for most families. For Arthur, the written exams were easy enough, but the lingering effects of his condition made some practical tests unstable. Charms and transfiguration gave him more trouble than the others. Still, his skill far outstripped that of the other first years, and in the end, he scored nearly full marks. Professor Binns had long ago taught history of magic, and had, of course, ever so slightly died, so Dumbledore himself proctored that paper. When Dumbledore collected the parchment, the students cheered. Many of the first years ran up to greet him. Then came a week's break. When the final results were posted a week later, Arthur unsurprisingly topped his year, with near-perfect scores across the board. His success reflected well on Snape and the other Slytherins of the first year, and it left Slytherin in the lead on the House Cup board. Slytherin, 490. Ravenclaw, 426. Hufflepuff, 352. Gryffindor, 300. With that margin, Slytherin seemed all but certain to keep the cup. But on the last day of the end-of-year feast, the tally was about to change. The students sat in their house tables, and the professors took their places at the staff table. Since Slytherin had held the cup the previous year, the Great Hall was hung in green and silver. A huge banner with the Slytherin serpent loomed behind the high table. Dumbledore stood at the central podium and beamed. Another year has passed, and it has been a wonderful one. As tradition demands, we will now present the House Cup. The current scores are as follows. 4th place, Gryffindor, 300 points. 3rd place, Hufflepuff, 352 points. Ravenclaw, 426 points. Slytherin, 490 points. At once, the three other houses fell quiet, while Slytherin exploded into triumphant cheering and a chaotic stomping of feet. Draco whooped and even grabbed at Arthur's sleeve, pounding the table with excitement. "All right, Draco, it's just a house cup," Arthur said, pulling his sleeve free. He didn't want Draco getting so carried away he'd knock over everything. "This is Slytherin's glory," Draco breathed, flushed with pride. Arthur felt none of it. To him, the cup had become a contest mostly between Slytherin and Gryffindor. Slytherin's streak of victories owed as much to Snape's watchful hand. Arthur suspected the head of Slytherin of fiddling with points as to the students' efforts. And lately Dumbledore had been openly inclined toward Gryffindor, particularly toward Harry. Giving points at term's end had become a way to raise Harry's standing within his house and to rally support around him. Dumbledore smiled faintly and addressed the hall. "These are the current scores, but a few incidents have been finalized after my communication with the Ministry of Magic, and they must now be reflected on the tally." He briefly recounted Quirrell's attempt to steal the Philosopher's Stone, carefully omitting several details and stressing only that Lord Voldemort had been involved. An agreed-upon version between Dumbledore and the Ministry that the Daily Prophet would carry later. Most wizards, stubborn as ever, still refused to believe Voldemort's return. Some whispered that Dumbledore was getting old and fanciful. The Great Hall grew very quiet, and the smiles faded from many Slytherin faces. Dumbledore's words were not good news for them. "I have a few prizes to award," Dumbledore continued. "First, Mr. Ron Weasley, for winning what was undoubtedly the finest game of wizard's chess witnessed here in many years. I award Gryffindor House 50 points. A roar of cheering from Gryffindor nearly shook the enchanted ceiling. The stars glittering above seemed to tremble. Second, Miss Hermione Granger, for her cool, logical deduction in the face of fire. I award Gryffindor House 50 points. Third, Mr. Neville Longbottom. There are many kinds of courage. It takes much bravery to stand up to our enemies, but it takes just as much to stand up to our friends. For this, I award Gryffindor House 50 points. Fourth, Mr. Harry Potter, for extraordinary bravery and daring. I award Gryffindor House 60 points. The uproar from Gryffindor swelled until it spilled out through the castle windows and rustled the edge of the forbidden forest. Students quickly did the mental arithmetic. Gryffindor had been on 300 and had just received 210 points, bringing them to 510, enough to overtake Slytherin's 490. The hall rang with ecstatic shouting. Gryffindor had won the House Cup. The Slytherin's jubilation turned instantly to fury. They had accumulated their lead slowly over the year, only to have it swept away in a matter of minutes. The injustice of it seemed to make some of them almost sick. Snape, sitting stiffly at the high table, stared at the back of Harry's head as the boy was hugged and praised, his gaze hard and full of contempt. Dumbledore raised both hands and the hall quieted again. Everyone stared at him, wondering what other surprises he might produce. "Gryffindor's points have been added," he said, smiling, "but there is still one house whose points have not yet been adjusted." He looked directly at Arthur, his eyes warming with a smile. When Dumbledore gave him a playful look, Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Could it be that the headmaster himself was the one saving him? Was Dumbledore about to award him extra points? The hall fell silent as the headmaster continued. "Fifth, Mr. Arthur Black. It is not only courage that deserves praise, but also the perseverance and clear-headedness in pursuing one's chosen path. There are always circumstances beyond our control, and there are things one can hold on to the end. Mr. Arthur Black, when faced with Professor Quirrell's coercion and traps, was able to analyze the situation rationally and, thereafter, bravely and decisively choose his own future. For this I award Slytherin 60 points." The previously disgruntled Slytherin students erupted again, cheering and dancing as their House Cup slipped back into Slytherin hands. They had won the Hogwarts House Cup 8 years in a row. Another moment of history. One by one, the Slytherins crowded around Arthur, voices all praise. He felt his face flush at Dumbledore's words. In truth, when he had last faced Voldemort's trap, he had had no way out. It had not been clarity, but a helpless acceptance born of past arrogance that had put him in that position. Words could be so persuasive. With dozens of mouths lavishing him with approval, Arthur felt a little overwhelmed and simply responded to each congratulation as best he could. Despite Slytherin taking the cup, the mood in Gryffindor remained upbeat. They had been only a step away from winning, and most of the students, while disappointed, were pleased nonetheless. That difference summed up the two houses. Slytherin prized glory, while Gryffindor prized the courage to press forward. From the Gryffindor's point of view, Harry and his friends had already shown the kind of bravery their house cherished, fully deserving of admiration. The castle was buoyant all around. Even Snape's mouth twitched into a rare, slight smile. This victory for Slytherin had been, in many ways, the culmination of his efforts. The feast that night lasted late. If there had been alcohol, Arthur thought, he might have been drunk. Dumbledore even raised his goblet to him from the high table. Slytherins who had once disliked Arthur, even some who were descended from Death Eaters, greeted him with smiles. This was a glory that belonged to the house. Talking with so many of his housemates, Arthur found himself reassessing some Slytherin values. Outside a small core of pure-blood zealots, most pureblood and the majority of half-blood wizards were simply proud of their magical identity and looked down on muggles and squibs as a matter of course. Ravenclaw and Gryffindor harbored similar attitudes. It was common among wizards who had never been exposed to the muggle world. After all, if you've grown up separated from muggle technology, it's easy to assume the wizarding world is inherently superior. Some wizards had never even seen a telephone. If the Daily Prophet ran pictures of a muggle nuclear explosion, many ordinary wizards might well assume muggles had developed the most formidable form of magic in history. They would likely lump muggles alongside the humanoid magical creatures in their world. That ignorance sprang largely from the near-total absence of contact between the two worlds. When the summer holidays began the next morning, Arthur took the Hogwarts Express home with Draco. He did not stop at Malfoy Manor, but returned to the Black family house. Kreacher wept openly at his arrival. His joy at being able to serve his master again seemed boundless. The summer break was long, 2.5 months, and Arthur did not go to France to visit his uncle Antoine Francois or Fleur. Instead, he buried himself in research, wandcraft, and Professor Binns's work on soul projection. As term approached, he finally finished the unicorn wand. Nearly all the materials had come from the unicorn itself. The shaft was carved from the very tip of the horn, stained with the creature's blood. The core was a tail hair, likewise blood-marked. At the base of the wand, Arthur had embedded an entire Philosopher's Stone, a crafted replica, but one capable of supplying a considerable reserve of magic. The unicorn's horn was not smooth. It spiraled with many indentations, and Arthur filled those hollows with strips of Thunderbird tail feather. He had bought several Thunderbird carcasses before, and though he used many feathers for this wand, a good number remained. He thought he might make clothing from the rest someday, when he had time. The finished wand was 15 inches long, the same length as the Elder Wand, and entirely dark red. 3 golden lines of Thunderbird feather inlay ran along the shaft, and a dark red gem capped the end. Inside that gem, hidden with an undetectable extension charm, lay the Philosopher's Stone. The stone was too large to attach directly without making the wand look grotesque, so Arthur had set it within the gem, both to protect it and to keep the wand's proportions elegant. At 12, Arthur looked a little awkward, waving a 15-inch wand, like a colt pulling a heavy cart, but in use it was effortless. A remnant of the unicorn's soul had lingered in the broken horn for nearly 3 months, and though it could not yet speak, it could respond in simple ways, making the wand float to follow him, nodding or shaking as if answering yes or no. The interaction was more impressive than practically useful, but it thrilled him. Even if Dumbledore offered to swap him the Elder Wand, Arthur thought he would refuse. This wand, made by his own hands and bonded to him, was the best fit. Charms were easier with it, and the Thunderbird feathers gave his lightning magic a notable edge. 69. New spell, Soul Guardian. The summer after first year passed in a blur of study. Arthur left home only once to visit the Malfoy Manor. Through a mixture of threats and persuasion, he finally got Lucius to hand over the notebook that Lord Voldemort had given him. The Ministry had been raiding Lucius's house repeatedly, searching for dark arts artifacts. He had already discarded or sold many illegal items to Borgin and Burke's in Knockturn Alley, but the notebook from Voldemort had tormented him. As head of the Malfoy family, Lucius knew things only senior Ministry officials knew. Despite the papers calling Dumbledore senile, Lucius had no doubt the headmaster was not suffering from Alzheimer's. Powerful wizards might lose strength with age, but they did not simply lose their minds. That made Lucius uneasy. If Voldemort returned and he couldn't produce the notebook, the Malfoy name would be ruined. But the Ministry's scrutiny was growing, and if investigators found the notebook in his home, he would go straight to Azkaban. So when Arthur showed up and demanded the notebook, Lucius balked, pleading with him. "Arthur, I don't know where you heard this, but listen. You're talented and you'll become powerful, but you're still too young. These are deep waters. You can't handle it." Arthur could hardly force the notebook from Lucius's hands, and hiding it with Ginny Weasley would make retrieval uncertain. Without hesitation, he invoked Dumbledore's name. "Lucius, you don't want this getting out, do you? I'm here because of Professor Dumbledore. He doesn't want the wizarding world disrupted, so he sent me to ask you to hand it over voluntarily." With Dumbledore's prestige and some information Draco had leaked, Lucius believed him. "Oh, so it was Dumbledore. Why didn't you say so? I'll give it to you." He smiled, fetched the notebook, and handed it over. In Lucius's mind, Dumbledore provided the perfect excuse. If Voldemort ever came back and demanded it, he could claim he had done his best to protect it and had been forced by Dumbledore's authority. At worst, he would grovel for a time, better than losing the whole family. Arthur needed the notebook for the fragment of Voldemort's soul it contained. Even a fragment of Voldemort's soul was unusually potent, and this notebook's piece was different from a typical Horcrux fragment. It carried an independent consciousness. Arthur planned to use it in his research into soul magic. Soul-based magic was the most dangerous of all. The unforgivable curses themselves damaged the soul, and such damage was the hardest to heal. Neville's parents, for example, were permanently ruined by Bellatrix's Crucio. Only constant care at St. Mungo's kept them alive. After studying Professor Binns's notes, Arthur had developed some soul-attacking magic of his own. His own soul shell had been repaired enough to be functional, though small fissures remained. According to Binns's conclusions, those tiny cracks would only become harmful after at least 150 years. If he used the repair magic Dumbledore had given him, he could extend that safely by about another 100 years, a delay Arthur considered negligible. It was like being offered 10 times what he owed and told to repay it in a century and a half. He had no reason to refuse. 3 weeks before school resumed, with his soul shell more stable, Arthur finally summoned a Patronus. To his surprise, his soul shell had taken a humanoid form, a hulking figure somewhat like the Hulk, and his Patronus manifested as a small giant roughly 3 meters tall. It called to mind Andros the Invincible, whose ancient Patronus had been an enormous giant. Arthur's was smaller, but still imposing. He also had a second Patronus, a unicorn, projected from an older unicorn soul shell. That unicorn was unusual, though. It bore an extra pair of wings, formed from a leftover Thunderbird soul shell he had fused on a whim. He had intended merely to combine the spare Thunderbird shell as an aesthetic addition, but both soul shells could manifest as Patronuses. Once he had the Patronus, an idea struck him. After performing soul projection, he injected soul power into the Patronus. The Patronus began to solidify, becoming less transparent and taking on a semi-solid, ghost-like form. To see whether this harmed the soul, Arthur bought some artificially bred magical creatures for experiments. The added soul power gave the modified Patronus the ability to attack souls directly. Arthur threw himself into refining the technique. At first it was clumsy: cast the Patronus charm, perform soul projection, then inject soul power, all while watching the caster's physical safety. He tested and tweaked until he reworked the Patronus principle itself. The result was a new spell he called Soul Guardian. Rather than a simple soul projection, Soul Guardian summons a soul shell to inhabit a Patronus, granting it soul-attacking capabilities it previously lacked. Because it summoned a soul shell instead of merely projecting it, the Soul Guardian could be targeted by enemy magic. Even a killing curse could strike it. Arthur, cautious, refused to summon the giant soul shell that housed his main soul. He used the unicorn shell instead. The unicorn shell served as a conduit. As long as it wasn't completely destroyed, he could replenish its soul power from the giant shell and repair it with other materials. In practice, the spell functioned almost like a soul-related magical item. After finishing the spell, Arthur's usual status panel updated to include it, an ability that had no equivalent in the original texts. Ladian Fawong, Thunderbolt King, age 12, height 156.5 centimeters, weight 43.2 kilogram, magic power 1472, skill 51, spells, discharge 9, palm thunder, lightning whip 3, soul guardian 2, patronus charm 4, soul projection 6, stupefy 4, finite incantatum 5, protego 4, levitation charm, axio 6, alchemy, ancient runes 4, wood carving 4, dragonhide engraving 1, wand making, transfiguration, shape-shifting 2, special, occlumency 4. After discovering that his newly developed soul guardian could summon a guardian capable of attacking souls, Arthur fetched the Slytherin locket he had been keeping at home. It was a relic of Salazar Slytherin and one of Lord Voldemort's Horcruxes. Arthur had recovered the locket early on while rebuilding the Black family mansion, but at the time he lacked the power to destroy a Horcrux, and it was impossible to hand it over directly to Dumbledore. In truth, the locket had little intrinsic power. Among Slytherin's relics, the real artifact of consequence was his wand. Like Gryffindor's sword, Slytherin's wand was a potent magical object, but it had been taken to America by Slytherin's descendants, and there was no way Hogwarts could demand it back. The events that would make the wand relevant were far in the future, so Arthur had stored the locket away. Now that he had the means to destroy a Horcrux, he could not keep it any longer. He raised his unicorn core wand and released a soul guardian. A translucent unicorn with great wings materialized, hovering over the locket. With an effortless sweep of Arthur's wand, the guardian lowered its head and charged. Its long horns, spear-like, drove through the locket. The physical locket showed no breakage, but a pathetic, keening wail seemed to come from inside, and a thin thread of black smoke rose and dissipated into the air. The guardian itself grew more transparent. Arthur felt its soul power ebb, but the Horcrux was gone. Projecting his own soul out to examine the aftermath, he found no trace of Voldemort's fragment left inside. He could, with justification, call himself a destroyer of Voldemort's Horcruxes. At present, his soul guardian could only target Voldemort's Horcruxes or ethereal creatures like ghosts. Ordinary witches and wizards were protected by their own soul shells, and Arthur's guardian was not yet capable of penetrating such defenses. Still, it was significant progress. Once he improved the magic and unlocked the special lightning element, he believed he could attach that power to the soul guardian and directly attack a wizard's soul. Even though a lightning-infused spell could accomplish a similar result, the soul guardian's advantage was convenience. Summon it with a single wand motion, and it could remain indefinitely, like a combat pet that, given the chance, could kill a group of opponents in an instant. After the locket's destruction, Arthur's soul, still projected, noticed something unexpected. A small piece of soul residue remained inside the Slytherin locket. It wasn't dark or corrupted. It was the purest thing he had ever seen, white, translucent, crystalline, utterly devoid of impurity, the opposite of Voldemort's stained black soul. When his soul touched that tiny cluster, he felt his own soul shell, previously hairline cracked, knit back together. The white fragment shrank to half its size. At first, Arthur suspected Voldemort had set a trap in the Horcrux to invade him, but on closer inspection his soul showed no corruption. There were no marks of soul curses, nothing like the residue that had attached to his shell before from the unicorn's remnant. If anything, this felt like a gift, not a curse, something Voldemort had unwittingly left behind, like a dropped gem in a post-apocalyptic tale. Seeing the remainder as useless to himself, Arthur fed the little white fragment to the remnant unicorn soul that inhabited his wand. If Voldemort's gift could heal him, it should benefit the remnant as well. The wand's remnant quickly absorbed it, then fluttered around Arthur like an overjoyed pup reunited with its owner. He felt a bright, excited emotion radiating from the wand. That reaction is what prompted Arthur to visit Lucius later and ask about Voldemort's notebook. During casual conversations around that time, the remnant souls in 2 more of Voldemort's Horcruxes were likewise annihilated. Whatever else Arthur had not anticipated, Voldemort had left behind another gift. With that second gift, the unicorn remnant in Arthur's wand fully awakened. Because part of Arthur's previous soul shell had intermingled with the severed unicorn remnant, the two of them, though from different species and hardly speaking the same way of thinking, could communicate directly. The unicorn introduced herself as Charlotte. She had been a princess of one of the unicorn herds in the Forbidden Forest, a potential heir of her line. Unicorns were powerful among magical creatures, but they were still no match for wizards, who sat at the top of the magical food chain. A young, not yet adult Charlotte had been captured without resistance when she encountered Voldemort and Quirrell. Knowing, in fragments, what had recently happened to Arthur, she decided to stay with him until he left the world. A repayment, she said, for bringing her back. Even after Charlotte awakened, some of Voldemort's gift remained. From the moment he resolved the last of the curse on himself up until the start of the school year, Arthur devoted his time to lightning magic and alchemy. It was while crafting an alchemical item that he discovered another important use for what Voldemort had inadvertently left behind. 71. Voldemort's sharply reduced resurrection coins. Arthur used alchemy to turn Lord Voldemort's gift into a magical necklace. It looked simple, a rope woven from unicorn tail hair with an oval gem set into it. He had originally intended it as a defensive trinket, an alchemical version of a shield charm to ward off enemy spells. He added an auto-targeting mechanism. When another wizard began to channel magic, the necklace would activate. The gem would detach from the cord and intercept the incoming spell aimed at Arthur. The design came from a book Nicholas Flamel had given him. Arthur followed the instructions and assembled it quickly. At first, the defensive necklace worked, but it was blunt and error-prone. Worn constantly, it caused trouble, and put on only at the start of a fight, it was less useful. Above all, it couldn't stop sneak attacks. So Arthur treated it as a practice item. Everything changed when he integrated Voldemort's residual soul fragment. The necklace suddenly felt much smarter. Before, any nearby magical fluctuation could set it off. It sometimes activated for spells aimed at someone else several meters away. After he added Voldemort's remnant, those misfires stopped as if the device had been upgraded. Arthur was astonished. He searched for similar remnants in creatures he killed, but found none. He suspected the phenomenon might be unique to powerful wizards. Whether every wizard left such traces, he didn't know. He wouldn't find out without encountering a wizard's death, and he had no intention of killing wizards to run experiments. The magical law books he'd read described a strange, curse-like rule. Deliberate murder could fragment a wizard's soul. Mild fragmentation might heal. Extreme fragmentation could permanently warp personality, sanity, and mental stability. Centuries ago, a wizard had gone mad after slaughtering many muggles. There were exceptions. Killing in immediate retaliation for grievous harm to a loved one, or killing an exceptionally evil wizard, might not cause fragmentation. The distinctions were subjective, as if some higher moral standard had been imposed to deter magical infighting. Arthur didn't trust these boundaries enough to use wizards as test subjects, nor did he want the enemy attention that would come from murdering respected elders. Powerful souls that could produce useful remnants were rare. Hunting them would be tantamount to war. Voldemort's remnants, however, were numerous. Arthur had already destroyed 2 Horcruxes. As a transmigrator familiar with the original tale, he knew another lay hidden in the Room of Requirement, Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem. He hadn't cared for Horcruxes before, but once he realized he could use what remained of a soul, he had to pursue them. Other Horcruxes were hard to find or dangerous. He would take them as needed. For now, Ravenclaw's diadem and his alchemical skills would keep him supplied for a long time. While Arthur happily refined the necklace, in the Albanian forest, Voldemort's soul clung to life by a thread. After the killing curse rebounded from Harry, he had fled, and now, with almost no power left, had been reduced to inhabiting a scrawny rat. He had no body, only a fragment of soul, and that fragment was weakened by a unicorn's curse. His recovery was agonizingly slow. He could barely exert control. He couldn't hiss Parseltongue to command the forest snakes, and being lodged in a rat made him vulnerable to those same snakes. He had lived like this for nearly a year, scavenging scraps and dodging predators. He'd considered suicide, using a Horcrux to reconstitute himself, but Horcruxes cost pieces of one's soul. Making or using them was a desperate, permanent severing of self. Voldemort prized his life. He would not further mutilate his soul. Even if he revived by a Horcrux, he would still lack a proper body, and an empty shell would gain him little against Dumbledore. Far better, he told himself, to endure and hope. In a couple of years, he might be able to parasitize a snake, and with a snake's body, his prospects would improve as Dumbledore inevitably waned with time. The rat let out a small, involuntary squeak of pleasure at that thought. The squeak was cut short when a little snake slid from the undergrowth and lunged for the rat. Voldemort's momentary joy turned to panic. He darted toward a hollow tree and squeezed through a narrow crack into another chamber, one of several escape routes he had painstakingly prepared. In his degraded state, he had spent months mapping the Albanian forest. No one knew the place better than he did. 72. 2 new professors. Soon, it was time for the new school year. Arthur even spotted Harry Potter on the train. Because Lucius had given him Lord Voldemort's diary, the incident with the Malfoy's house elf Dobby overhearing Lucius plotting against Harry never happened. Dobby wasn't freed and never came to stop Harry from returning to school. Everyone arrived safely at Hogwarts. This was Arthur's second year. Second years no longer crossed the Black Lake by boat. They rode in carriages pulled by thestrals. Thestrals aren't like unicorns. There's none of that forbidding mystique about them, so they showed no hostility toward Arthur. After the last term, when 2 thestrals had once been manipulated by Lord Voldemort, Dumbledore had placed charms on them to prevent a repeat. Having witnessed Quirrell's death and felt the weight of it, Arthur now understood what it meant to see death. Only wizards who had seen and comprehended death can see thestrals, so Arthur could clearly make them out in front of the carriage. They were not pretty. Too thin, with coarse coats and skeletal wings, far from the noble image of a unicorn. Otherwise, Arthur thought many wizards might prefer thestrals for travel. Draco, who shared Arthur's carriage, reached out just as it began to move and accidentally brushed a thestral's tail hair. He recoiled, curling in toward Arthur as if for protection. Nervous, he peered over and asked, "Arthur, what's in front of us? I touched something. What was that?" "Don't worry," Arthur said. "Those are thestrals, winged horses. But only people who have seen death can see them." Draco shivered. You've seen death?" "Of course." Arthur rolled his eyes. "Last term I lost points because of Quirrell. He died right in front of me. Poof, just turned to ash. No funeral, nothing." Draco slapped his forehead. "Oh, right, I forgot about that. By the way, defense against the dark arts this year is taught by Gilderoy Lockhart. He's a huge celebrity. Mother adores him. He published so many books that everyone's had to buy 7 new ones. Father says he makes at least 3 galleons per copy. I reckon he came to Hogwarts to make money." As Draco complained, he glanced toward the next carriage and sneered at Harry and Ron. Looking at Ron's patched robes, he added, "Do you know who heads the Weasley family?" "Also an Arthur. I met them in Diagon Alley over the summer. The Weasleys have half a dozen kids. Lockhart's made things worse. They could only afford second-hand books. No surprise people say there isn't a single galleon in their vault." Arthur turned to look. In the adjacent carriage sat Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, Hermione Granger, and Neville Longbottom. Neville, who would later stand out in other stories, was already often with Harry. The trio had become a quartet. Arthur couldn't help picturing the famous Harry trio hug from the films. How would a group of 4 manage that pose? 3's a crowd. Someone's always the odd one out. Harry and the others met their gaze. Perhaps from not having seen each other in ages, Draco resumed his taunts. Arthur even gave Draco the seat nearer to Harry's carriage, almost as an apology. Draco liked to provoke Harry. The thestrals were fast. Arthur and his companions reached the Great Hall almost half an hour before the first years arrived. Nearly all the Slytherins greeted Arthur. He felt his face would cramp from smiling. Soon the new first years processed into the Great Hall, and the sorting began. After the sorting and his usual remarks, Dumbledore introduced the new professors for the year. Most faces at the staff table were familiar to Arthur. There were only 2 newcomers. One was unmistakable, Gilderoy Lockhart. Flamboyant in appearance, with golden, wavy hair, bright blue eyes, and a dazzling smile, he sat like a peacock among chickens. Even Arthur found his looks impressive. As one of the wizarding world's most famous celebrities, Lockhart had a certain presence. When Dumbledore finished, Lockhart leapt to his feet with a flash of white teeth and a booming voice. Hello, everyone. I am Gilderoy Lockhart, internationally renowned author, recipient of the Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Arts Defense League, and 5-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award. I don't rely on my smile to fend off vampires, he added with a grin, but on my considerable skill. With me as your defense against the dark arts professor this year, you will learn things you never expected. Sitting beside Lockhart was the other new professor. Compared with Lockhart, he was discreet. His robes weren't flashy, but they were clearly expensive, embroidered with fine patterns. As Lockhart finished and waved toward him, the man's expression darkened at the mention of vampires. He glanced once at Dumbledore, rose, and in a somewhat hoarse voice said, "Walter Bernhard, your future professor of the history of magic." Arthur, watching closely, noticed something odd when Bernhard spoke. 4 sharp teeth glinted briefly, like a vampire's fangs. After learning that the new Professor Walter Bernhard was almost certainly a vampire, Arthur glanced over at Dumbledore, who sat in the center of the staff table. Dumbledore certainly had a talent for hiring whoever he pleased and making them professors. This year it was a vampire. Next year, perhaps a werewolf. Between them, the 2 most infamous creatures of the dark arts were represented. Vampires and werewolves were not only historic enemies, they also shared a dangerous trait. They could pass their condition to ordinary wizards. A single bite could be enough. The mechanics, however, were different for each species. Werewolves required the transformation of a full moon and the mixing of saliva with the victim's blood to cause a true change. A scratch alone would not turn someone. It would only leave permanent, unhealing scars. If a bite happened on a night other than the full moon, even if the victim's blood met the werewolf's saliva, the victim would not transform into a werewolf. They might, however, show some werewolf-like tendencies, a taste for bloody raw meat, a habit of howling at the moon. Vampires infected people through blood exchange. They would draw out part of the victim's blood and then replace it with their own. To become a full vampire, at least a third of the victim's blood had to be replaced, which was a great cost to the vampire as well. For that reason, vampires usually only drew blood unilaterally. Without the reciprocal exchange, the victim would not turn. A simple bite that didn't kill the victim could still leave them with vampire-like traits: a craving for fresh blood, an aversion to sunlight, a sensitivity to garlic. There was a third possibility as well. If some vampire blood entered the victim but replaced less than a third of their blood, they would not become a vampire, but might gain certain advantages, a stronger body and an extended lifespan, while becoming far more vulnerable to sunlight, to the point of suffering burns from exposure. Knowing this, some muggles, desperate to cure disease or extend their lives, allowed vampires to infect them deliberately. In this magical world, ordinary vampires usually lived around 200 years, far longer than most wizards, and they practiced unique blood magics. They did have serious weaknesses compared to wizards. Sunlight weakened them, and the vampire infection, a strange curse of blood and soul, prevented a wizard's magic from functioning as it had before. Ordinary wizards therefore rarely consented to being turned. A few muggles, who wanted magical benefits without studying, accepted the infection. These so-called pseudo-vampires formed a low-status class among the vampire community. They called themselves the bloodline and served vampires with labor, money, and influence. Many high-ranking officials in small Eastern European states were among them, which helped make vampires one of the largest powers in the magical world, second only to wizards. With the resources of the Muggle world behind them and the fact that vampires did not lose their minds on the full moon like werewolves, vampires had managed to keep werewolves largely suppressed for centuries. All of this explained why Professor Bernhard made no effort to hide what he was. On his first History of Magic class at Hogwarts, Bernhard held the lesson in an underground classroom. Halfway through, one of the students caught sight of his sharp teeth and pointed them out. Bernhard admitted it openly. "Yes," he said, "I am a vampire, the sort you read about in your textbooks." He looked down at the girl who had spoken up. "What is your name?" "Parvati Patil," she answered. Bernhard nodded and glanced at her Gryffindor robes. Very good, Miss Patil. For your keen observation, I'll award Gryffindor 5 points. Once he'd revealed himself, the history class quickly turned into something resembling Defense Against the Dark Arts, with questions about vampires pouring in from every side. Even Slytherin, usually reserved, joined in. How old are you? A Gryffindor student asked first. Probably around 150 years, Bernhard said. He looked about 30 in human terms, youthful, vigorous, and the students were stunned. Some of them had grandmothers younger than Professor Bernhard. The questions came faster. What is blood magic? Can sunlight kill a vampire? Are vampires repelled by crucifixes? Do vampire hunters exist? Are vampires part of the church? Bernhard spent the rest of the lesson answering, recounting things not written in the history of magic books, and describing encounters he had lived through himself. Compared to Professor Binz's dry lectures, Bernhard's stories were vivid, immediate, and unforgettable. In a very short time, history of magic, once one of the dullest subjects, became one of the most popular courses. Gilderoy Lockhart watched all this with visible irritation. The attention Bernhard had won should have been his. Lockhart busied himself in his office late into the night, intent on giving a defense against the dark arts class that none of the students would ever forget. The next morning, he arrived in the Great Hall, ready for his moment. Seeing Dumbledore in purple, he too wore a lavender robe and had doused himself in so much lavender perfume that Arthur, sitting at the Slytherin table more than 10 meters away, could detect the scent. Professors Snape and Sprout, standing nearby, could not. As herbologists, they were used to subtle aromas. Lockhart's overbearing perfume made them both recoil. Snape flung his robe around himself and stalked out of the hall without breakfast. Sprout, Hufflepuff's head of house and accustomed to the kitchens, followed him. Lockhart did not seem to mind. After breakfast, he spent some time outside the hall signing autographs for admiring girls and inhaling the adoration. There is a cost to everything. By midday, he had won the hearts of many witches and the dislike of many young male wizards who did not appreciate seeing their crushes clustered around Lockhart. When class time approached, Lockhart tucked away his peacock feather quill, smiled his practiced smile, and addressed his followers with mock modesty. "Oh, dear ones, I know you love my most charming smile," he told them. "I've won Witch Weekly's most charming smile 5 times, but I never boast. I think of you every time I smile. Now I must go and give a defense against the dark arts lesson they will never forget." He pushed through the crowd and strode to his classroom. A witch he brushed against watched him go with rapt fascination. "Professor Lockhart touched my shoulder," she cried, then swooned, face flushed. By the time Lockhart entered the room, the second-year students from Slytherin and Gryffindor had already gathered. Arthur sat as he usually did with Draco, but conveniently gave Draco the aisle seat so he could show off to Harry Potter like a peacock fanning his tail. This year, Slytherin only shared 2 classes with Gryffindor, History of Magic and Defense Against the Dark Arts, both taught by the new professors. 74. Lockhart's Questionnaire. When Gilderoy Lockhart entered the classroom, every student turned to watch him. He was used to those admiring looks. In the public eye, he was not only a famous wizard, but also widely regarded as one of the most handsome men in the world. He raised a hand, shushed the room with a practiced flourish, and announced, "I, Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Defense Against the Dark Arts League, and 5-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, though I do not boast, for honors are hollow without strength, and clearly I possess that strength." Arthur, sitting in his seat, almost stood up and slapped him. He had heard that self-introduction once already at the start of term feast. Hearing it again made his teeth ache. Lockhart continued, brisk and beaming, "We'll begin with a little test today so I can assess your progress." He handed out sheets and returned to the podium. "You have 30 minutes. Begin." Arthur stared at the paper in disbelief. 30 questions, 3 full pages, every one about Lockhart. What is Gilderoy Lockhart's favorite color? What is Gilderoy Lockhart's birthday? What gift does he most desire? There wasn't a single question about Defense Against the Dark Arts. Arthur felt like walking out. The whole lesson was a publicity survey, not a class. He left his sheet blank and handed it back. Many of the other students frowned, baffled. Lockhart had turned a defense class into a fan club meeting, worse than Professor Quirrell, whose textbooks at least looked legitimate. After collecting the papers, Lockhart began to mark them, calling out answers as he flipped through. Ah, everyone must remember, my favorite color is purple. I mentioned it in A Year with a Yeti. Oh, Miss Hermione Granger knows my ambition is to rid the world of evil. 100 points. Where is Miss Hermione Granger? Hermione raised her trembling hand, face alight with excitement. Ron scowled beside her. Harry watched, expressionless. He still had a soft spot for a pretty face. Lockhart beamed. Excellent. I'll award Gryffindor 10 points. As he continued, he came to the blank papers and went livid. He held up the stack and barked. Whose papers are these? Draco, sitting near Arthur, was startled. He knew Arthur had handed in a blank sheet. He leaned over and whispered, Arthur, will this be all right? Arthur patted his shoulder. Draco, remember who you are. You're the sole heir of the Malfoy family. When you're in the right, what have you to fear? Then more quietly, well, except for Lord Voldemort. Draco hesitated, then understood. Why should a professor frighten him? The Malfoys were one of the most powerful families in the wizarding world. Major shareholders in Britain's largest press, allies of the House of Black, and with Lucius Malfoy on the Hogwarts Board of Governors. For a pointless stunt like today's, his father could easily rally other parents to put pressure on Lockhart. Lockhart thundered again. Whose papers are these? Completely blank and without a name. He had been the beloved center of attention since arriving at Hogwarts. This felt like a slap in the face. Arthur stood up. Those are my papers, Professor Lockhart. Professor, Lockhart snapped. What's your name? I'm deducting 50 points from Slytherin. He was so flustered, his smile looked strained. Arthur's voice was calm. I think your reaction is irrational. My name is Arthur Black. At the name Black, Lockhart's tone changed. He had heard at a banquet that the only heir of the House of Black, one of the great capitalist families of the wizarding world, was named Arthur Black and was studying at Hogwarts. In that light, Lockhart's rage looked risky. He forced a stiff smile and stammered, Mr. Black, indeed, a man of honor. I did lose my composure. For Mr. Black's honesty, I will award Slytherin 100 points. The students sneered behind their hands, amused by how quickly Lockhart had backpedaled. Arthur sat down again. He had known what kind of man Lockhart was long before this class, a celebrity who used the memory charm to ambush real adventurers, erase their memories, and then write their tales as his own. Lockhart's books had been built on stolen lives. Arthur hated Lockhart for it. There were degrees of memory charm, some light, some severe. Hermione's future use of a memory charm on her parents would be a light one meant to protect them without permanent harm. The memory could be restored if they ever saw what they had lost. A severe memory charm, though, could permanently erase whole stretches of a person's life, leaving them diminished. Neville Longbottom's family had used memory charms after his traumatic childhood, and he grew forgetful for years. Bertha Jorkins had been left so altered after her encounter with Barty's memory magic that she became unreliable at work. And Lockhart's victims often lost memories of months or years of adventure, lives permanently taken from them, so he could claim the glory. Those brave wizards and witches, thrown into danger and stripped of their past, were left with nothing. Even if they could have written their own stories, even if their prose was less polished than Lockhart's, they would at least have kept their memories, and a future they might have reclaimed. Professor Lockhart collected the short quizzes without bothering to mark them and flashed his customary dazzling smile. Showing 8 gleaming teeth, he addressed the students. That was only a little joke between us. Now, let's begin Defense Against the Dark Arts properly. He stooped behind the podium and produced a large covered cage, setting it on the desk. He had spent a small fortune the night before buying it from a wizard who trafficked in contraband in Hogsmeade. My job is to teach you to defend yourselves against the most evil things the magical world has to offer. Today you will face something terrifying right here in class. But don't worry, as long as I'm here, nothing will happen to you. With a flourish, he put a hand on the cover and whipped it away. Ta-da! Cornish pixies, just caught yesterday. Ministry rating XXX. The pixies were entirely cerulean, about 8 inches tall, with pointed faces and shrill, piercing cries like a flock of squabbling parakeets. The moment the cover came off, they began chattering and leaping in the cage, making grotesque faces at the students. Many of the children looked alarmed. Lockhart loved their reactions. He had once again seized the moment. He opened the cage grandly and announced, "Today's lesson is dealing with them. Believe in yourselves. I only needed 10, no, 2.5 minutes to catch them in the wild." Most of the students had stopped listening. The Cornish pixies were far cleverer than Lockhart had expected. When released, they ignored the adult and went straight for the students. Several shot out the window, leaving a trail of broken glass. The rest ran amok. 2 grabbed Neville by the ears, hoisted him, and left him dangling from the chandelier. Others shredded books and papers and tossed them out the broken panes. Chaos erupted. No one could concentrate on Lockhart now. Everyone was grabbing whatever they could to swat at the pixies. "Come on, catch them. They're only pixies," Lockhart cried when no one moved. His shout turned the pixies' attention on him. He fumbled for his wand and shouted, "Pesky pixie pesternomi." That was the little calming charm the seller had shown him when he bought the pixies. Either the seller had lied, or Lockhart had never really learned the incantation properly. The spell did nothing. One pixie grabbed the wand from his hand and flung it out the window. Lockhart, pale with fear and drenched in sweat, dove under the podium and hid. Without the big one to bully, the pixies grew bolder and swarmed toward Arthur. Arthur raised his left hand, and his wand floated from his pocket into his grip. He pointed it lightly at the pixies. Without a complex incantation, just a bright lash of magic from his wand, the pixies were struck and collapsed, stunned into stillness. Cornish pixies are rated XX by the Ministry, troublesome, but creatures a competent witch or wizard can handle. In a fair one-on-one, most of the students could probably subdue them after an initial tussle. With a few white flashes from Arthur's wand, all the pixies lay motionless, as if asleep. He flicked his wand again and lowered Neville from the chandelier. "Arthur, you're brilliant," Draco said admiringly. While Arthur had been firing those jolt-like charms, he'd also been practicing the motion beside him. Most of his spells hadn't hit anything. Arthur clapped him on the shoulder. "Keep practicing. Pixies are good targets." Seeing the subdued pixies, Arthur thought of a practice method. A one-way barrier that let the pixies in but not out, so students could aim from outside. It would be useful in the room of requirement, though he decided it would be a little cruel. Cornish pixies weren't murderous after all. Draco reached out to inspect Arthur's wand. "Wow, Arthur, is that a new wand? It's so long and thick, with gold threads running through it, like veins. It's incredible." Arthur merely nodded. He had grown used to odd analogies. Ginny, in a love-struck letter, had once described Harry's eyes as green like a pickled toad, and Newt Scamander was no better at comparisons. Lockhart reappeared at the podium and, seeing the pixies down, pretended to approve. He turned to Arthur. "Excellent, Mr. Black. I knew I was right about you. You're a genius. Exactly the result I expected. 30 points to Slytherin." The bell for the end of class rang. Lockhart ignored the students' chatter, smiled faintly, and hurried out. His wand had landed somewhere below, and he needed it back. With a wand, he could at least flash light in people's eyes. Without one, he was useless. After Lockhart left, the students argued. Hermione, a devoted admirer of Lockhart, spoke up first. "Professor was only giving us practical experience. We've all read his books. Think of the adventures he's survived. Even Aurors couldn't do what he does." Ron, less convinced, snorted. "He just says he did it. If I wrote a book claiming I'd killed 100 dragons, would that make me the greatest dragon slayer?" The Slytherins were unanimous. Lockhart was, at best, a poser, another Quirrell. They tended to be more pragmatic than the boisterous Gryffindors and quicker to size up a wizard's true worth. From what they had just seen, Lockhart had been wildly ineffectual when a student was dangling from a chandelier and had even had his wand snatched away. Some wizards would rather lose a hand than their wand. Draco, having taken the lead in mocking Lockhart, grinned and strode to the window where Lockhart was hunting in the grass. "Hello, Professor. Looking for the wand that the pixie stole and threw out the window?" Draco's training last term had paid off. While he couldn't yet hit a darting pixie, he could spot a small wooden stick in the undergrowth. He flicked his wand and shouted, "Accio wand!" Under the charm, Lockhart's wand flew straight into Draco's hand. He held it up triumphantly. "Professor, is this yours? What do you think of that charm? Pretty neat, eh?" He was like a child with a favorite toy, shouting and waving it. Students began spilling out into the corridor, eager to watch. Lockhart, who had been far from grandstanding with his wandless status, could only smile and answer, "Ah, yes, clever Slytherin. That Accio was excellent. Mine is quite good too. I just didn't have my wand on me then. As you know, my power is considerable, though I am not at Professor Dumbledore's level, and I have not yet mastered true wandless magic." Arthur watched Draco with a bemused expression. "You never cease to amaze me. If obnoxiousness were a talent, I'd crown you the champion." "Really? Stronger than you?" Draco asked. Arthur sounded certain. "Of course, far stronger than me." Draco puffed up. "Very well. I'll be the best at it. First place, step by step." When Lockhart returned to the classroom, Draco tossed the wand back. Lockhart fumbled it, and it slipped before he managed to hold it properly. He bent to pick it up, cleared his throat twice, and mumbled, "I ran up from below. My hands were a little shaky." By now, most of the students had started to doubt Lockhart. His first class had not inspired confidence. He had handed Slytherin 30 points and collapsed in a panic when a pixie took his wand. As Lockhart began to leave, Draco called after him with a final barb. "Professor, you didn't put the pixies back in their cage. They'll wake up soon, but with your record of handling vampires, I suppose pixies should be no problem for you." 76. A different dark magic world. A day passed quickly after Lockhart's first defense against the dark arts lesson. Because of the joke he made during Arthur's class, he hadn't caused any further incident. Instead, like the late Professor Quirrell, he fell back on telling stories from his adventure books. By the second day, almost everyone at Hogwarts had worked out that the new Dada professor was mostly a pretty face. The other new professor, Walter Bernhard, who taught history of magic, was much better received. His demonstrations, particularly a display of blood control magic, astonished many of the students. Rumors started. Wouldn't Bernhard make a better defense against the dark arts teacher? After all, Lockhart loved to tell stories, and history of magic was practically storytelling. The idea spread, and soon Bernhard's name was on everyone's lips. Lockhart heard the gossip and grew anxious. He was a star. If word got out that he'd been demoted for incompetence, his reputation would be ruined. He began scheming about how to recover his image and become everyone's favorite again, not just the odd autograph seeker. Bernhard, for his part, sought out Arthur. As a vampire, he taught in a dungeon classroom and kept an office underground near the Slytherin dormitory. One afternoon, as Arthur was coming back from the room of requirement, Bernhard stopped him. "Mr. Black, do you have a moment to speak?" "Of course, Professor Bernhard. Your history of magic class is excellent, probably the best we've ever had." Bernhard smiled and led Arthur to his office. Arthur, wary after the previous lesson, slipped a fragment of the Philosopher's Stone into his hand as a precaution. He'd been carrying the fragment for some time and knew only two practical uses for it: to provide raw magical power, as he had once done by installing a fragment in a unicorn hair wand, or to destroy the fragment's structure and detonate it like a grenade. The latter was dangerous. The blast radius couldn't be finely controlled. He could only safely blow up fragments the size of fingernails, and even then, the force was roughly equivalent to two experienced aurors casting an exploding charm at the same time. Bernhard's office was all shadows and crimson. Moonlight slanted through a small high window, revealing a room dominated by black and blood red. The layout was otherwise unremarkable, but the air carried a faint metallic scent. Blood, Arthur realized, coming from a goblet of red liquid on the desk. A beautiful sword lay beside the desk, its scabbard and hilt inlaid with gems. Bernhard sat behind the desk. He looked no older than 30, with the handsome, aristocratic looks of a medieval noble. But his eyes were a deep red, and his pallor was unnatural, striking enough that, in looks alone, he might even rival Lockhart. "Have a seat," Bernhard said. "I wanted to speak with you about something. Would you care for a drink?" "Iced lemonade, please, some fruit sugar." Bernhard raised an eyebrow. "Iced. It's not very warm at the moment." He pressed a button on the desk. A house elf Arthur recognized, one who had delivered meals to him the previous term, appeared. With a little gesture, the elf set a small table and a glass of iced lemonade before Arthur. Arthur took a sip and met Bernhard's gaze. "What did you want to discuss?" "It's not urgent, but I'm in a bit of a predicament," Bernhard said. "The upheavals in Eastern Europe have put most vampires on edge. My friends and I need a secure place to retreat." Arthur frowned. Britain's Ministry of Magic kept the British wizarding world largely separate from continental affairs. He only followed European news through conversations with Fleur and occasional letters. Still, if something had the vampiric stronghold in Eastern Europe stirred, it couldn't be trivial. "Does this have anything to do with me?" he asked bluntly. Bernhard nodded. "Yes, I need an island as a future home for myself and some allies. I understand the House of Black owns an island in the Tyrrhenian Sea near the Lipari Islands, and I would like to buy it." As the sole heir of the House of Black, Arthur had the legal right to sell the island, but he had no memory of that particular property. His family had holdings scattered across the world. "I don't recall that island," he said. "I'll have Creature look up the deed and check the records." Bernhard's expression remained amiable. "That will be sufficient. Let me know when you have it. The situation in Eastern Europe isn't critical yet, but time is not on our side." When Arthur left Bernhard's office, he immediately wrote to Creature, asking the house elf to find the deed and, if possible, visit the island and report back on its condition. He also wrote to his uncle, Antoine Francois, requesting a detailed account of what was happening in Europe. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Antoine. The situation, the letter explained, had been deteriorating for about a year. An organization called the Eye of Truth had appeared, initially ignored by European ministries. Small, strange groups formed every so often, and unless they openly embraced the dark arts, they were often tolerated. But 6 months earlier, the Eye of Truth began an aggressive recruitment drive, bringing in wizards, werewolves, vila, and a large number of vampires. Once it had consolidated resources and manpower, the organization dropped all pretense. Its goals were the supremacy of the wizarding world, to preemptively act before Muggles learned of magic, and to abolish the International Statute of Secrecy of 1689. No more hiding in the shadows, they proclaimed. Magical folk should no longer be forced into secrecy. The rights and freedoms of witches, wizards, and other magical beings should be restored. Those aims resembled the rhetoric preached by Gellert Grindelwald, and then went further by openly calling for a unification of all magical creatures. The major European ministries responded, barring them with aurors and security. Unable to withstand coordinated action, the Eye of Truth went underground. Over the next half-year, however, the organization used its ideology, vast and somewhat mysterious financial resources, and organized outreach to recruit more followers. Vampires were the largest single contingent. Vampires in this world still nominally observed an ancient hierarchy centered on a vampire council. In practice, the council's rigid system made lower-ranked vampires into little more than servants to higher bloodlines. Many middle and lower-ranking vampires resented that conservatism. The Eye of Truth's message of freedom and a new order therefore resonated, and the internal tensions exploded. Skirmishes had already broken out. It was only a matter of time before a full-scale civil war erupted among vampiric factions. Reading his uncle's account and piecing together what he knew of vampires and werewolves in this world, Arthur had a sudden, disquieting realization. This was not the simple Harry Potter universe he remembered. Things were different here in fundamental ways. Perhaps the reason so many events around him were diverging from the original story. 77. Wizards' Dueling Club. The werewolves and vampires in this world were more like the creatures in the underworld films Arthur had watched in his previous life. Vampires had a vampire council, 3 elder vampires, and other institutions the original Harry Potter books rarely mentioned. Their origin, like the werewolves, traced back to one extraordinary mortal, Alexander Corvinus. In the early 5th century, he caught a plague that should have killed him, but instead he survived and became immortal. The first recorded immortal. His 2 sons inherited something of his nature, though weaker. One was bitten by a wolf, the other by a bat. After their bodies changed, they became the progenitors of modern werewolves and vampires. Because their descendants transmitted their condition far more effectively than the old breeds, within a century, they had largely supplanted the earlier wolves and vampires across Europe. But even in this Harry Potter world, Alexander Corvinus did not live forever. When he was over 300 years old, a faction of dark wizards decided to seize his power through magical experiments. Facing such opponents, Corvinus was helpless. He became their test subject. The research, carried out by many of the era's greatest wizards, learned little except that Corvinus's body was, paradoxically, almost indistinguishable from a wizard's. He possessed magic, and in enormous quantities, almost like an obscurial. Remember, he had been an ordinary man before. After a period of instruction, he could even use magic proficiently. The wizards' curiosity grew, but their experiments yielded no real answers. Corvinus did not survive the ordeal. After his death, they examined his two transformed sons, but found nothing to explain Corvinus's uniqueness. The sons had only a small amount of magic, and, unlike Corvinus, they aged, merely much more slowly than ordinary humans. One of the werewolf progenitors was later imprisoned for excessive killing, but aside from that, wizards classified the others as a new type of natural magical creature. Over time, their numbers swelled. By the present day, Europe was dominated by werewolves and vampires alongside wizards, while many formerly numerous magical beings, Vila, Lamia, and the like, declined. Knowing this made Arthur take Professor Bernhard, the vampire instructor, less skeptically. A week later, Creature delivered a letter. He had scoured the island and found nothing unusual, and had taken photographs of various places, nothing that set off alarms. So Arthur agreed to Bernhard's proposed exchange, accepting 1,000 galleons in return for the uninhabited island. It was only symbolic. Arthur didn't need the land, and gaining the favor of a seemingly high-ranking vampire was more useful than keeping a vacant piece of property. His only source of reliable information in Europe had been his uncle, Antoine Francois. The Francois family were only an up-and-coming line in France, so their intelligence was second-hand. Bernhard, as a long-lived vampire, would likely hear of any major developments in Eastern Europe, such as the outbreak of a first magical creature war. Arthur could then warn Fleur and others so they could seek refuge in Britain. After the deal, Bernhard became noticeably friendlier. He greeted Arthur, conversed more, and their relationship thawed. While Bernhard hunted for a refuge, another new professor, Gilderoy Lockhart, was busier than he seemed. Arthur had watched him going in and out of the headmaster's office several times. Then, a month into the school year, Lockhart finally performed for an audience. On Friday morning, as the students ate in the Great Hall, Lockhart appeared in a blaze of magenta, his robes flamboyant and impossible to ignore. Beside him stood Professor Severus Snape, dressed in his usual black, ankle-length robes. The effect was like a swan and an ugly duckling on the same stage. Lockhart clapped hands and bawled for attention. Gather round, gather round! Can everyone hear me? Professor Dumbledore has kindly permitted me to start a dueling club so I may properly train you all, so that, should you ever need to defend yourselves, you can do so in the way I have innumerable times. For the finer points, I invite you to consult my published works. Everything is laid out quite clearly. The students at their tables booed immediately. A month in, it was common knowledge that Lockhart, the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, was the least competent of the lot. Even the eccentric divination professor, Sybil Trelawney, could at least lift a wand and waggle it about. Lockhart seemed only able to use his as an unreliable flashlight. Yet Arthur admired Lockhart's thick skin. Under the torrent of insults, the man's smile hardly faltered. Allow me to introduce my assistant for the demonstration, Professor Snape. Lockhart continued. Professor Dumbledore assures me he knows a thing or two about dueling and is an excellent opponent. After I spoke with him, he very graciously agreed to assist me for a small exhibition when the dueling club opens this weekend. The demonstration will be on Sunday at 9 in the morning, right here in the Great Hall. Of course, I won't leave you in fear. After the display, I will return your potions professor to you completely unharmed. No need to worry. Lockhart stood beaming as if the Great Hall had become his personal theater. The announcement set some students buzzing. Draco Malfoy, in particular, was thrilled. He had beaten Harry in their last duel and was eager for another chance to humiliate him. At breakfast, he turned to Arthur. "Arthur, are you going to take part?" he asked. Arthur had been studying magic steadily and thought a little diversion would do him good. He agreed. Sunday morning, Draco arrived early in the room of requirement to find him. Unlike Arthur, who wanted to watch Lockhart's show, Draco wanted a rematch with Harry Potter. He had been practicing and was brimming with confidence. He claimed he could defeat 10 versions of his former self. By that logic, he felt certain he could easily defeat Harry. 78. Lockhart's amazing performance. It was Sunday morning. The Great Hall was already packed with students, and even Quidditch, the most beloved sport among them, had adjusted its weekend training schedule for the Wizard Dueling Club. Arthur arrived with Draco. They greeted friends along the way and took the front row seats Slytherin had reserved for them. For the Dueling Club, the Great Hall had been redecorated. In the normally spacious center, a long raised platform had been built and covered with a red carpet. It looked like the stage used for the opening feast and the sorting hat ceremony, only much wider, so duelists could move left and right to dodge spells. Professor Lockhart was at the professor's table, circulating and greeting the students. Arthur wondered what was going through his head. Did Lockhart truly believe he was a great wizard because he had written so many books about himself? With all the flattery from colleagues and students, perhaps he really had convinced himself. That would explain why, no matter what embarrassment befell him, feeling unwell, misplacing his wand, botching a spell, he always found some excuse and kept smiling, basking in the applause. Still, the idea of a dueling club was a smart one. After a month of Lockhart's story-filled lessons, many students were ready to believe his excuses. Right on 9 o'clock, precisely on time, Professor Lockhart nudged Professor Snape and strode to the middle of the dueling platform. A line ran down the center. When Snape took his place opposite him, Lockhart announced loudly, "Hello, everyone. Your indomitable defense against the dark arts professor has fully recovered from the injuries of his last adventure. Now you will see for yourselves." They bowed. Lockhart's bow was an extravagant 90-degree flourish, his wand twirling. Snape gave only a short, impatient nod. Clearly, over the past month, Snape had decided Lockhart was mostly show. They raised their wands, holding them upright in front of their chests like swords. Lockhart continued, "As you can see, when wizards duel, we adopt this stance. On the count of 3, we will cast our first spells. Though rest assured, I would never take my dear colleague's life, and I'm sure he feels the same." Not all the students felt reassured. The Gryffindors secretly hoped both professors would get injured and be replaced. Students from other houses wanted Snape to humiliate Lockhart, so Hogwarts could have a real defense against the dark arts teacher. After a month of Lockhart's storytelling, plenty of them were tired. 1, 2, 3, Lockhart cried. Both men sprang into action. Snape shouted, "Expelliarmus," and a vivid red beam shot from his wand. Just as it was about to strike, Lockhart waved his wand and produced a small red orb at its tip. The orb met the red beam and deflected it. The Great Hall went completely still. This was not the Lockhart everyone expected. For the first time, Arthur even saw a flicker of surprise on Snape's face. Lockhart didn't follow up with an attack. He simply stood there, basking in the approving looks from below. A girl in the crowd whispered, "See? I told you. He was injured before. This is his real strength. He's better than Professor Quirrell. Snape doesn't stand a chance." Arthur watched Lockhart. This performance did not match the bumbling professor he'd seen over the past month. Could this Lockhart really be different from the one in the original tale? If the books were true descriptions of his exploits, he'd be a remarkably powerful wizard, and a veteran of dangerous adventures might indeed fight as effectively as Hogwarts heads of house. Yet Arthur had witnessed Lockhart's earlier embarrassing acts. If that Lockhart were genuine, he would long ago have been exposed. Those clownish moments hadn't been staged. Before Arthur could think further, Snape recovered his composure and fired again. "Expelliarmus." This time the beam looked thicker, more forceful. Lockhart's eyes widened, then he answered in kind. "Expelliarmus." 2 red lights met and exploded into a shower of sparks, an actual clash of magic. After a tense exchange, Lockhart stopped pouring magic into his wand. Without continued channeling, his counterspell gave way. Snape's expelliarmus pierced through and shot toward him, but Lockhart had stepped a few paces to the right and avoided it. He then held his wand horizontally across his chest, palm toward himself, and bowed, the conventional dueling gesture that signals a draw. Since this was meant as a demonstration, Snape, whether he wanted to press further or not, matched the gesture, and the duel ended. The outcome altered the students' opinion of Lockhart overnight. Almost everyone concluded that his previous blunders had been due to injury. Even Arthur, who knew the original story, felt his doubts grow. Lockhart showed no sign of strain. If anything, the cheers from the crowd flushed his face and made him look as excited as on the first day of school. Only two possibilities occurred to Arthur. The simplest, this Lockhart really was different from the Lockhart in the tale. The other, someone else was manipulating or supporting him. But who could be behind it? Voldemort was nearly destroyed, a remnant of a soul at most. In his last rise, even Quirrell's boost had only gone so far. Even if Voldemort's remnant poured all its power into Lockhart, it wouldn't necessarily explain this performance. Besides, that remnant still bore the unicorn curse. If Voldemort actually showed up at Hogwarts, the awakened Charlotte would sense him. Who else was left? Arthur thought of Professor Bernhard, the vampire who had come to Hogwarts with Lockhart, but dismissed him too. Vampire half-bloods differ from other half-bloods, Vila, or human hybrids. A half-blood vampire cannot use standard wizarding magic. They can wield a peculiar blood-based power unique to their kind, but it doesn't grant ordinary spellcasting prowess. In the end, Arthur shrugged the mystery off. It wasn't his problem. Defense against the dark arts was notoriously a one-year position. Voldemort's curse usually ensured that no one stayed more than a year. Unless Lockhart had mastered curses beyond Voldemort himself, he would be gone after this year, regardless of what was really going on. 79. Draco and Harry's duel again. After the professor's exhibition duel, it was naturally the younger wizard's turn, the whole reason the club was so popular. Who wouldn't want to stand before the entire school and have a heroic moment? Maybe even meet someone. Except for the few wizarding families that still insisted on the old one-on-one tutoring, most students came to Hogwarts for a shared education. That meant your future partner was most likely someone from your year. Lockhart, eager for attention, was the first professor to pick. He chose Harry Potter without hesitation. Aside from Dumbledore, Harry was the best-known wizard in the school. Snape, as head of Slytherin, was expected to pick a Slytherin, and his eyes swept the benches. He could have chosen Arthur. Everyone at Hogwarts, teachers and students alike, had noticed Arthur's strength ever since the Slytherin incidents, but that would make the result predictable. If Arthur faced Harry, everyone would expect Arthur to win. Snape deliberately chose Draco Malfoy, standing beside Arthur. Draco's recent practice in charms with Arthur had improved him a great deal, Snape had been told, and defeating Harry with Draco would be that much sweeter, preferably by a well-placed levacorpus. After a few whispered words from Snape, Draco was sent up onto the dueling stage. He wasted no time with pleasantries. "Potter," he drawled, chin high, "you're not my match. I've been studying with Arthur for 6 months. One flick of my wand and you'll be flat on the floor." Harry felt a flush of irritation but kept his face steady. "Dream on, Malfoy. You're not beating me." Before the insults could escalate, Lockhart, self-appointed referee, took charge. "Face each other, raise your wands, and bow, just like we did." Both boys bowed formally, though their eyes never left each other. Lockhart counted out loud. 1, 2, 3. They moved almost at the same instant. Arthur, watching from below the stage, saw clearly that Harry's reaction was quicker. Draco barely had his wand leveled before Harry had already begun the incantation. Draco's 6 months of practice hadn't been wasted, though. Instead of attempting a full verbal spell, he poured raw magic through his wand. A blast of unchecked force would do little against an adult, but against a student it staggered Harry, interrupting his chant. Sensing advantage, Draco shouted, "Levacorpus!" A white jet of light struck Harry, but even as he steadied himself, Harry managed to cry, "Tarantalegra!" Both spells found their marks. Draco's legs started to prune and kick uncontrollably. He began to dance awkwardly on the stage. All bluster suddenly turned into frenetic movement. Harry shot up toward the ceiling, hanging upside down as his robes fell over his face. His heavy cloak pinned his legs so he could hardly move his arms. While Draco spun and twisted, he used the moment and, thanks to his training in hitting moving targets, managed to aim and send Tarantallegra back at Harry. Now each boy was besieged by two spells. Draco's legs kept jerking, and Harry's lower body stayed stuck to the ceiling while his upper body swayed madly. The sight was ridiculous. Two dueling students dancing and flailing as if trying to swat invisible flies. Laughter rippled through the younger wizards. Snape's lips twitched in a rare, cold amusement. Draco, catching his breath between hops, tried several practiced Expelliarmus attempts he'd learned from the charm book Arthur had given him. His disarms tugged at Harry's wand but lacked power. Harry clutched his wand so tight the spells did nothing more than make him wince. After a few minutes, the magic began to peter out. The charms wore off. Draco stopped dancing, sweat running down his face, he half-kneeling, gasping for breath. Harry dropped from the ceiling and hit the stage with a heavy thud, which made half the students gasp. He was lucky. Snape had, at the last second, cast a cushioning charm on the spot to break the fall. Harry was shaken, his arms weak, but none of his limbs were broken. The Gryffindor stubbornness that had driven him through past fights flared up. He regretted having no weapon and no strength left in his arms, but he decided on a simple, physical solution. He ran at Draco and kicked him, trying to knock him off the stage. Harry didn't know every rule of wizard dueling, but he guessed that tossing an opponent off the platform counted as a win. Draco grabbed at Harry's robes. Both of them tumbled down onto the stage and began grappling in a close, grim scuffle. Lockhart and Snape had to intervene and pull them apart. In the end, by the rules the referees enforced, Draco was declared the winner. Harry had crossed the center line and initiated the physical attack first. The duel was meant to test magical skill, not hand-to-hand combat. Both boys were bruised and sore and were escorted straight to the hospital wing, continuing to trade curses under their breath the whole way. The match had been more childish than noble, but it thrilled the other students. A real opportunity to fight was always exciting. Afterward, Lockhart and Snape set up several smaller dueling stages so the younger wizards could take turns testing themselves. 80. Magic that fuses soul and lightning. After the last Wizards Duel Club, Lockhart's reputation returned to its former glory. A crowd of younger students followed him after every class, hanging on his every word. He still told the same stories from his books and staged role-playing demonstrations in class, and that only made some of the students more suspicious, convinced he must have used a potion or some alchemical trick in his duel with Snape. Because Arthur carried the extra prestige of his identity, Lockhart never pressed him after the first class, and Arthur was free to continue his own work. By the 4th month of the term, Arthur's research into lightning magic finally produced a breakthrough. He modified the Patronus charm, fusing it with his lightning magic, so that, when he cast a Patronus, a lightning-imbued phantom would manifest alongside it. Since his principal soul shell at the time took the form of a small giant, the Patronus that appeared looked like a larger version of himself, a thunder god statue wrapped in crackling lightning. He tested the new effect in the room of requirement. A giant over 3 meters tall materialized behind him, and it behaved as if it were a deity. It could autonomously employ the lightning magic Arthur had already mastered, acting according to his will. For example, the palm thunder Arthur himself used normally affected only a meter or two, but channeled through the Patronus, the lightning ball swelled to nearly the size of the giant. When it struck the floor of the room of requirement, the whole room shook. A circular crater nearly 5 meters across remained after the lightning faded, a display of power that even startled Arthur. The cost was steep. The spell drained almost half of his magic reserves. This amplified effect was produced using yang lightning. At the same time, Arthur continued studying yin lightning. Previously, because of the influence of the unicorn's curse, he had been cautious with yin lightning. An uncontrolled remnant of that curse might have ended everything. After the previous summer, however, the unicorn's remnant soul had finally separated from his body, and Arthur began to push further with yin lightning. The unicorn's influence, though, had left a trace. Even after Charlotte's resurrection, Arthur's yin lightning behaved differently, and Charlotte herself could not explain why. In the unicorn histories she knew, there were similar cases of wizards being affected, but none described a wizard's innate abilities changing because of the unicorn's curse. She could only confirm one thing. The power now present in Arthur's yin lightning was his alone and would not be subject to her control. Arthur logged that and kept working. He discovered that his yin lightning had gained an extra function. Where yin lightning had traditionally been used for control and defense, after the unicorn incident, a thin red thread appeared within it. That red filament seemed conductive, allowing far finer control. Arthur could make his yin lightning coil and bind like a rope, entangling foes with precise movement. From that, he devised a new technique. First, he would generate a large volume of yin lightning to form a trapping field, a kind of quagmire that restrained an opponent's movement, an effect already present in his template. Then, the quagmire would extend red, lightning-laced threads like tentacles to further immobilize and entwine targets. He could also form the yin lightning into a ring to surround himself, producing a defensive circle that could block incoming charms, something akin to Grindelwald's gas-like barrier. Arthur named the technique Lightning Shield. The defensive ring was not perfect. Because Arthur could not use legilimency, he couldn't reliably read whether close-by opponents intended to attack, which weakened the shield's tactical usefulness. He planned to use alchemy to make tools that would help detect hostile intent. His soul could perform such detection, but in combat he preferred not to project his soul unless absolutely necessary. As he developed these spells, their names and levels appeared on his panel, and the research improved several of his other abilities as well. Age 12. Height 157.5 cm, weight 43.9 kg, magic power 647, skill 55, charms, discharge 9, palm thunder 6, lightning whip 4, soul guardian 5, patronus charm, modified 3, soul projection 6, lightning shield 1, finite incantatum 6, protego 4, alchemy, ancient runes 6, wood carving 4, dragonhide engraving 1, wand making 5, gemstone carving 1. Transfiguration, shape-shifting 2, special, occlumency 4. Because so much effort went into soul magic and lightning magic, his transfiguration progress had stalled. Only the slightest improvements showed in the panel. Occlumency had made virtually no progress at all. During this period, Arthur also returned Ravenclaw's diadem from the Room of Requirement and destroyed the fragment of Lord Voldemort's soul inside it. Voldemort's life count dropped by 1 more. Counting Arthur's earlier actions, Voldemort had now lost 3 Horcruxes at Arthur's hands: Slytherin's locket, Tom Riddle's diary, and Ravenclaw's diadem. The diadem also gave Arthur abundant materials for further alchemical work. He had learned that remnants of Voldemort's soul could be used to create intelligent alchemical items, and if those resources proved insufficient, he might have to seek out Voldemort's other Horcruxes. He already knew the locations of them all. Except for the 2 living Horcruxes, Harry Potter and Nagini, the rest could be destroyed directly.